Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Senior B English. We are working with T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. This is the lecture over the Dry Salvages, part 3 of the Four Quartets. We've already given a lecture on the introduction to Four Quartets, and then we've also lectured on Bert Norton as well as East Coker. Now we turn to Dry Salvages, published in 1941 during the air raids, actually, on Great Britain and London. T.S. Eliot himself was actually kind of like a night watchman, a guard, if you will, of a certain area, and so he very personally was involved in this kind of situation. The Dry Salvages, we are told in some comments at the very beginning of this poem, are the rock formation off of Cape Ann there. This is, of course, going to make this then the poem of place that is an American poem of place, as opposed to the other three areas that are from England itself. And very often, as a child, T.S. Eliot spent time off of Cape Ann and this area, this rock formation in the ocean there. And in fact, what else is fascinating about this area that's referenced by Dry Salvages is that Andrew Eliot, the ancestor of T.S. Eliot, from East Coker area and the East Coker region, as we talked about in our last lecture, he actually traveled in 1669 to this very place. So in other words, it's kind of fascinating that this will be the emphasized place in America. Now again, as we've already said, hit learnstrong.net in the Senior B folder to find my lectures already on what we've done with Four Quartets, as well as, and this is really important, I think, again, for our study of this poem. You want to hear what I've said already about the Wasteland, the Hollow Men, Journey of the Magi, and, of course, the Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock. If you've kind of been exposed to all that information, it will help you in your reading and in your study of Dry Salvages. Now again, just to remind, our learning theory, this is hypercritical for us in our study. We're always looking to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, especially in our reading or our annotative work. At level 1, we answer the question, what does this text say? Summarizing. At level 2, what does this text mean? 2a, we're working with themes, messages. 2b, we're concentrating on rhetoric, not what Eliot says, but how he says it. Here, we're going to continue our concentration on symbols and notions of representation, the repeating as well as the symbols and the ideas of how things are represented, metaphors and the like, similes at times. We're going to continue with our same approach here. It's interesting, by Dry Salvages, we know through any number of different avenues, letters, comments made by T.S. Eliot, that he was consciously now extending the Four Quartets. He was deliberately writing now, after the East Coker poems, he was deliberately writing Four Quartets, understanding that Dry Salvages and then getting the poem to follow would culminate with this Four Quartets. Again, think about that musical references that we have made in earlier lectures, right? So in other words, what I want to say now is, we're halfway through the Four Quartets. Think about that. And I'm hoping that your reading of Bert Norton and East Coker will help to inform you about what it is that's coming. For example, knowing the structure, of course from our poems we would use the word pattern, right, will help. Let's do some quick background information here. Published, as we said, in 1941 February in the New English Weekly. We will link in this poem two important bodies of water. First, the Mississippi River. Eliot grew up much of his young life in St. Louis, and so he knows that brown god of a river very, very well. And then the Atlantic Ocean, he sailed in Gloucester Harbor, actually off Cape Ann, where the Dry Salvages are, as a young man, and loved sailing. So we're going to have the joining then of what some scholars have pointed out as water and hope, or water and illumination. And the idea, of course, here is going to be continued as we say, this is the American poem. Now, I should point out, there are some people right away who had problems with this. They didn't like this poem, and in fact said as much, that this is the weakest of the four, etc., etc. And some argued that one of the reasons is because it is so American. Others have said, you know, there's clearly a little bit different kind of tonal references in this poem, and yet this is every bit as remarkable a poem as the other three would be. But for example, I mean, I'll just give you a classic example of how we can label this as an American poem. In line 118, for example, we're going to get a reference to the dead Negroes that will be in the Mississippi River. Well, this will lead some people to ask, is T.S. Eliot the great racist, or is T.S. Eliot in many ways ahead of his time by pointing out the fact that during and preceding to the American Civil War, that in fact slaves were often treated as no more important than, for example, other animals that will be listed in that list. I only point this out to kind of get us ready for this study. Let's just go ahead and say, though, that this poem has its controversies. You have a Christian poet, remember 1927, he is going to convert to the Anglican, the English Church, and he also in this poem is going to celebrate the Bhagavad Gita, which is the greatest Hindu text. So I mean, how do you square those two things? Well, obviously I have to talk about it. The pattern, as we've pointed out earlier, now that you've done 2 of these poems, you can pick this one up much easier. So let's play that game really quickly. I would create a little chart. Across the top I would put section 1, then section 2, then section 3, then section 4, and then finally movement 5. Remember, each one of the 4 poems are divided into these 5 sections, very similar to, for example, The Wasteland. And then on the left-hand side, I would put the 3 poems that the 2 we've already studied, and the one we're about to study in Burt Norton and in East Coker, and then finally Dry Salvages, we're working with here. In terms of the elements, Burt Norton is, as we have said already, focusing on air. In the first section, where we always have our landscape meditation, we have the lotus and the rose, right? The second section, where we have the interior illumination, we have the still point in Burt Norton. In the interdisciplinary discipline of the interspiritual discipline of section 3 always, for Burt Norton we have that descend lower reference. In section 4, which is always that devotional lyric poem of Burt Norton, we have the Kingfisher's Wing. And then in section 5 we have the unitive vision, and here we have the coexistence, as we talked about it in our earlier lecture. East Coker, not emphasizing air, but emphasizing earth, will have in section 1 an open field as opposed to the lotus rose. In section 2, the wisdom of humility, that coincides obviously with the still point of the turning world. In section 3, we have that for spiritual discipline, be still. In section 4, the devotional lyric, we have the wounded surgeon and the Good Friday lines that we talked about. And finally, in section 5, the vision here is union and communion. Now, having done that, let's turn now to the 3rd poem. This is Dry Salvages, which will focus not on air, Burt Norton, not on earth, East Coker, but rather on water. In the first section then, for our landscape meditation, we're going to have some comments about rivers and oceans or seas. In the second, the interior illumination, we're going to talk about a sudden illumination, and we'll ask what that could be about. In the 3rd section, that's that spiritual discipline section, we're going to be talking about fare forward. This will be the Krishna's yoga of Bhagavad Gita passage 2. We'll have more to say about that in a bit. In the 4th section, that devotional lyric, we're going to see some references to the Queen of Heaven, namely Mary. Okay. And then finally, in the 5th section, the vision here will be the impossible union, as it will be referenced. Now, no question, to read Dry Salvages is easier, and some have argued more accessible, if you know Burt Norton and East Coker. Some have said that Dry Salvages is just easier to read because somehow the tone has changed a little bit. I'm going to leave that one up to you to decide. Okay. Again, as we said, Dry Salvages had its serious critics, but I want to argue it is an amazing poem, and in fact, for many of my students, Dry Salvages is their favorite of the 4. So I'm going to leave that one out there for you. Obviously, you can't make a judgment like that until you finish Little Gidding, and then we've finished all 4 of the poems, right? In the last lecture on East Coker, I read for you from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. There's a time for this, and a time for this, and a time for this, because it's clear that that was standing behind so much of what was happening in East Coker. For us to read Dry Salvages, you have to have some sense of some really important lines from the Bhagavad Gita. Now, let's do some quick understandings here. The Upanishadic texts, this is the Hindu scriptures. If you think about the Bible as Christian scripture, and the central tenet of, at least for Christians, of the Bible is the Gospels, those 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The same is kind of understood in Hindu texts, The Bhagavad Gita, the Gita for short, is kind of like that central part of all of the Hindu texts. The great Gandhi, who was very familiar with both of those texts, as was T.S. Eliot, both the Bible as well as Hindu texts, he always said that the Gita is kind of like the heart, in the same way that the Gospels, and more particularly the Sermon on the Mount, is for the study of the Gospels. There's a passage in Gita too, and we'll have more to say about this when we get finally to actually this. The Bhagavad Gita is actually a dialogue. Think about your Plato here. A spiritual dialogue, a devotional dialogue between Krishna, who is the incarnation of God, right, and Arjuna, this young warrior who doesn't want to go and fight for reasons that are, at least we understand them to be really good reasons. I mean, he doesn't want to go out and kill and fight in the war. And Krishna will have this long conversation with Arjuna. In the second book of the Bhagavad Gita, he talks about this notion of why we do what we do. And he says it this way. Krishna says to Arjuna, you have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either. Now, T.S. Eliot is going to use this idea, and he will be emphasizing it all the way through the Dry Salvages. Especially, though, we'll emphasize it, as we said just a few seconds ago, emphasizing it especially in section 3. We'll get there. All right, let's turn now to Dry Salvages Part 1. We're ready to take our notes, enough background information. Let's go to work with it. We're going to call this one The River and the Sea, if you need a title for Dry Salvages 1. By the way, this is lines 1 through 50, unless you're working with that cumulative count, and then it's lines 390 to 439, okay? Now, as we've used in the past, we will continue our reading, oral reading, by the great Alec Guinness, and then after we've read, we will come back to explicate. So have your text open. The challenge, as we said in earlier lectures, is to conquer monkey mind. This sounds very much like some of the ideas of four quartets thus far. And really try and focus in the reading and get some sense of what's going on. We're also going to spend a little bit of time, as soon as our reading is over, asking this simple question. How does Dry Salvages, the opening lines, differ from the opening lines of Burt Norton as well as East Coker? All right, here we go. Let's pay attention. We are working now with the opening lines, Part 1, the Dry Salvages.
I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable, patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, useful, untrustworthy as a conveyor of commerce, then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities, ever, however, implacable, keeping his seasons and rages, destroyer, reminder of what men choose to forget, unhonored, unpropitiated by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching, and waiting. His rhythm was present in the nursery bedroom, in the rank ailanthus of the April dooryard, in the smell of grapes on the autumn table, and the evening circle in the winter gaslight. The river is within us, and the sea is all about us. The sea is the land's edge also, the granite into which it reaches, the beaches where it tosses its hints of earlier and other creation. The starfish, the hermit crab, the whale's backbone, the pools where it offers to our curiosity the more delicate algae and the sea anemone. It tosses up our losses, the torn seine, the shattered lobster pot, the broken oar, and the gear of foreign dead men. The sea has many voices, many gods, and many voices. The salt is on the briar rose, the fog is in the fir trees. The sea howl and the sea yelp are different voices, often together heard. The whine in the rigging, the menace and caress of wave that breaks on water, the distant rote in the granite teeth, and the wailing warning from the approaching headland are all sea voices, and the heaving groaner rounded homewards, and the seagull. And under the oppression of the silent fog, the tolling bell measures time, not our time, wrung by the unhurried groundswell, a time older than the time of chronometers, older than time counted by anxious, worried women, lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel, and piece together the past and the future between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception, the future futureless, before the morning watch, when time stops and time is never ending, and the groundswell that is and was from the beginning clangs the bell.
All right, let's turn now. We are into the opening lines. By the way, depending on how you count it, I like to count it as 14. And the opening 14 lines, and what do we call a poem that is 14 lines long? You're right, it is a sonnet. Some have seen these opening lines as very Whitman-esque, and I think that there's good reason to kind of see it that way. Think about this one. When you look at the opening lines, for example, of Burnt Norton, I mean, just go back there really quickly. You have your copy in front of you. The opening lines of Burnt Norton, just look at them on the page and notice we have uniform line lengths, we have a certain kind of speculative time present and time past, or both perhaps present and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. A very kind of speculative, prosaic, we might even say, opening set of lines. When we turn to East Coker, notice that it looks, again, a little bit different on the page. Notice here we have a far more rhythmic, musical kind of language. And here, the inevitable cycle of change and decay through time. In my beginning is my end. In succession, notice the word again used, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur and feces, bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Now when we turn to the Dry Salvages, the opening of this poem, already on the page, notice how it looks differently. For those of us who have studied our Whitman, I've given lots of lectures at learnstrong.net on Whitman, notice that the length of the line is much longer. Did you notice this? The elongated, sometimes the word here is Whitman-esque kinds of lines. Notice as well there's a bit more brooding that might be happening here as well, right? Now, of course, the key symbol right away is going to be the river. Notice how he begins, right? So he starts right away with an observation. Now, it takes us back to a comment that we made before about epistemology, the things that we know and how we know them. Remember? I know absolutely for certain, that's one end of the spectrum. Of course, the problem with that is that sometimes, people do crazy things because they're absolutely sure. Its complete opposite is the relative position. There are no absolutes. There is no absolute truth. Of course, it sounds kind of like an absolute truth to say there is no absolute truth, what we call the performative contradiction, right? Okay. In the middle, that epistemological position is what we will call the fallibilist position. You remember at the very beginning, we just read the lines, right? Time past and time present. Perhaps, he uses that word in the second line, right? The fallibilist position. Notice right away, and there are readers who did not like this when this poem was published, because it's a strange first line. I do not know much about gods. Notice, it sounds very much like the fallibilist position. In other words, this is not an absolute certainty. He says, there's a lot I don't know. He injects the notion of his own ignorance. Now, of course, this is going back to East Coker and the idea of humility. Let's begin, he says, by actually practicing what we preach. In other words, I'm going to begin with some humility. Notice it's not God, it's God's, right? And right away, this will take us later in the poem, the line 216. His hints and guesses will be the language that gets used. In other words, because we're dealing again with issues of time, with issues of spirituality, we are working with trends linguistic. beyond language. And because that's the case, he's not sure. And then he says it, but I think the river is a strong brown god. Now, the use of the adjective brown has been commented on many times, and some have pointed out that this is kind of T.S. Eliot in his racist language. I think that's unfair to Eliot. I think what he's saying is that if you look at the Mississippi River, it's almost inevitably always disgusting brown, right? Okay. And immediately when we think about the Mississippi River, again, T.S. Eliot, growing up much of his youth in St. Louis, saw this river often, and in fact commented on the fact that the river was a huge part of who he was and his identity as an American. We immediately, of course, think of Twain and Huck Finn, and of course we've given lectures on that as well, right? What is this brown god? Sullen, untamed, intractable. By the way, notice your threes already, that listing of threes after the dash. Patient to some degree at first recognized. How do we see rivers? Well, first, it's a frontier. In other words, it's for voyagers. It's for explorers, back to East Coker. Useful, untrustworthy. You never know what that Mississippi is. It's very dangerous, as you know from your reading of Huck Finn, right? As a conveyor of commerce, it allows people to make money. Bits of paper was the use of the line before. Then, only a problem. I love, by the way, how T.S. Eliot uses the word only and almost. It's fun to kind of see this stuff happening now that we're into the third poem. Then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. Technology and civilization, in the end, go from respecting rivers and seeing them as somehow sacred and holy to being finally something that can be conquered vis-a-vis technology, right? The problem, once solved, again he uses the phrase, the brown god, is almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities. This takes us, of course, to Nietzsche's God is dead passage. God is dead, we have killed him. Almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities. Notice we have the distinction between city and country, right? We saw this in East Coast.